Hello, my name's Gaia. I'm an illustrator and I do a bit of graphic design as well. So this is a bit of an introductory series just with a few fun exercises just to kind of help you build that kind of visual vocabulary and just to get you kind of comfortable and get you used to kind of sort of visual problem solving. So last time we had a look at that silly old owl meme on how to draw an owl, where it, rather helpfully tells you to draw a circle, then draw the rest of the owl. It goes into depth on how you actually build up that kind of, how do you build up an owl from, well, you start with basic shapes. So today we're going to have a look at trees. Trees were something that I really did struggle with early on because they've got quite a lot of different sort of like elements to them. But again, with any problem, it's about breaking it down into simple tasks and, laying down that simple structure. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start with, quite a sort of like generic kind of looking tree. So just imagine it's like an oak or something. Right, so what we're going to do is, what you want to do is you want to get the basic shape of the trunk in. Put some cute squiggly bark on there, because why not get some roots in there. What we'll go on to later on as well is kind of sort of like mark making and kind of getting you comfortable with the, sorry, I'm getting a bit carried away, getting you comfortable with kind of sort of making different marks. And sorry, I got a bit carried away with the roots in the bark. Okay, what you want to do, right, okay, so you've got your trunk. That's your basic trunk. You can put some grass on there as well. Yeah, what you want to do, so what I suggested in the last video as well, is what you want to do is you want to get yourself a sketchbook. They're really cheap. Tiger, if you're in the UK, I don't know, if you have kind of Tiger in sort of, if you're in America, or if you're kind of in the EU, I don't know if you have something like Tiger, but Flying Tiger, this is not a plug, but anyway, they have cheap sketchbooks. Really cheap. Get yourself, I like cheap ballpoint pens. Yeah, get yourself a sketchbook, get yourself out, get yourself sort of like, make some, silly rubbings of some bark, or sort of like, just get used to the pen in your hand and get used to kind of making marks and being kind of free, with that mark making. So we'll get onto like mark making, and we'll get onto sort of like, more complex things like sort of like, kind of perspective and shading a little bit later on. But right now we're going to have a little look at how you kind of break down quite a complex shape like a tree. So what I would suggest, and what kind of made it click for me, is, I don't know if any of you kind of went down a bit of a lockdown rabbit hole with just like, for me it was bonsai for a little bit, and kitchen nightmares. That was a weird one. Anyway, bonsai. Yeah, so what they do with bonsai is they kind of train them to, so, obviously they'll train the trunk, but also what they do is they have like these pads of leaves. So when you're looking at a tree, it can look like quite a complex, kind of sort of like difficult to approach kind of sort of shape. So it's kind of like a similar situation to, I don't know, if you started out trying to draw hair, it's kind of sort of like an early doors kind of sort of like, oh my god, there are so many strands of hair, where do I start? What a lot of people will do is they'll like draw an oval for a face, and they'll, draw a couple of eyes and a nose and a mouth, and then they'll try and do each and every, because it's a natural thing to do, is to kind of sort of like, you see like grass is the same, like hair is the same. When you've got something like grass or hair or leaves, it's very, very easy to, like, excuse the pun, lose the wood for the trees, basically. You start kind of sort of like doing each and every strand, and then you get very, very lost in it. So what you want to do, so look at bonsai, they're great, because what they do is they train them to have like these pads of leaves. So they have these very defined pads of leaves. So what you want to do with a tree is, when you're trying to draw a tree, is you'll sketch in the main branches, and then you've got the kind of branches that come out like that. So, get the main branches kind of in there. And what they'll do is, you know, branches, they have that lovely kind of fractal branching. If you look at fractals, it's like, you know, self-same shapes. Again, with leaves, you look at the veins on leaves, you get those self-same shapes. I love drawing ferns, where you get that kind of sort of fractal, kind of self-same. So it's a triangle. So it's a triangle like that, and then it's made up of other triangles. Each of those little triangles have little triangles. You'll have to bear with me, I go off on tangents, but it does make sense. Or at least I think so anyway. So yeah, you've got a fern, you've got those little triangles made of triangles, so I'll make it easy for you there. So you've got a triangle, made of triangle, and each of those triangles we've made of a triangle, and that's what's going on with the tree. So you've got the main trunk, and then you've got these branches, and they'll branch out. You know, you've seen a tree, I'm sure. Okay, so why this is important for a tree is, like I said, go have a little look. They're really calming. Go get a if you're cross, if you're frustrated, if you've had a hard day at work, grab yourself a peppermint tea and pop on some Bondi videos. That absolutely lovely way to decompress after, you know, a stressful work day. Maybe get your sketchbook out, have a nice bath, get your sketchbook out, get your peppermint tea and sketch some bonsai. I would advocate for sketching from videos and sketching from Google Images, fine. What that does do, tangent alert, is it flattens your eye and it gives you eye strain. We spend too much time in front of the screen these days, hello. And yeah, it gives you furious eye strain. And also, you know, it kind of gets you used to visually kind of occupying that flat space. So absolutely fine way to spend an evening kind of unwinding and decompressing with your sketchbook and in your, you know, cup of peppermint tea or like jasmine tea, something soothing, something gentle, something hydrating. And, you know, yeah, just, you know, sit yourself down and, you know, pop on the bonsai video. And what they do is they train these lovely little trees into kind of having these nice defined pads of leaves. So what happens is you've got your trunk and you've got your branches, they branch out like that, and then you've got at the end of it, you've got these kind of sort of like pads of leaves. So you want to get the shape on, and what I would suggest as well is I mean, I'm doing it all in marker pen because it registers a little bit better on the camera. What you want to do is you want to get yourself a nice sort of like nice soft pencil, do your sketchwork in the pencil, and then kind of sort of like, you know, you kind of block in the detail with something, you know, a little bit sort of like, I like to use ballpoint pens. We'll get into kind of sort of experimenting with mark making and different kinds of sort of like, you know, paints and kind of sort of like, so I'm an illustrator. So I'm not kind of sort of like, you know, a dedicated painter. I'm interested in kind of sort of like, how can we visually express ourselves? What are we trying to explore? What are we trying to, you know, say? What are we kind of, right, so, right, illustration at the moment, it's gotten a little bit stuck in the Quentin Blake era with, you know, I love ink pens. I'm a big fan of ink pens, but, you know, I love that kind of scratchy, expressive. It's, you know, it's fun, it's expressive, but like, you know, it can get sort of like what we're trying to do. And what I like, you know, why I'm an illustrator is it's about, you know, it's, you don't have to be a, right, okay, and I have to be careful how I say this. You don't have to be sort of like, you can be naive art does very, very well in illustration because it's about what you're saying with it. It's about what impression you're giving. So like you've got some packaging and you want to, you know, what sort of packaging, who are you aiming it at? You want to kind of sort of like, you know, kind of use that visual vocabulary to give an impression. So, right, okay, we'll get into that later. Massive side tangent, but basically what you're doing with illustration is you're saying something with it. So you can say it with paints, you can say it if you want something like hard and crisp and clean. I also do a lot of digital vector work because I love how crisp and clean it is. It's wonderful for logo work, for spot illustrations, for, you know, I like all of that kind of fine line detail. That's my kind of place. But we'll get onto that a bit later about sort of like, you know, being expressive with your mediums. So yeah, it's one of the things I love about illustration is you can get expressive with your mediums because it's about what you're trying to say. So with something like graphics design, you know, it's much more kind of sort of like technical. The thing is with illustration, and I want to be careful how I say this, is you don't have to worry too much about being too technically skilled. I personally like to get into all of the silly, you know, Baroque detail. I like my, you know, lovely sort of like ink sort of like filigree and sort of like, you know, I like to get into the silly detail because that's just me. But the reason why I like illustration, it's about what you're trying to say and you're trying to express. What medium do you want to kind of use? What are you trying to say? How do you accomplish that? How do you achieve that? It's about being experimental and expressive. So yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later, but right now let's focus on this tree. Let's focus on why it's important to have that technical underpinning. I do feel with, you know, even though with illustration, you know, naive art can do very well. There's, you know, a big thing for that kind of sort of like big, chunky, expressive, sort of like, you know, simple, bold lines. You know, it gets your point across, it's friendly, it's welcoming, it's open. So yeah, naive art can do quite well. But why I still do think it's very important to have that technical underpinning is because it's sort of like, you know, it gives that kind of structure to your work. So it's the old thing of learning the rules so you can break them. So if you understand the rules, you can more effectively break them. So what we're going to do, we're going to focus on this tree. It's not going to be the best tree, but that's not the point. We're looking at the structure of the tree. So, okay, with a bonsai. So what you want to be looking at with the bonsai is that they have these very defined pads of leaves. So how you approach a tree is a big complex shape with lots and lots and lots of leaves. So what you want to do is you want to block out these big areas of leaves. So you've got some big areas of leaves there, and you've got some big areas of leaves there. And where you will, sorry, I've run out of electrical tape to stick this up. So what you want to do is you want to, so the ends of the branches, so you get your trunk in first and you get your branches in and they will branch out, and the ends of those kind of sort of terminal branches are where you want to put your pads of leaves. So go like that, go like that. So that will inform, so where these kind of terminal branches are will inform where these pads of leaves are. And it's easier if you're looking at an actual tree. This is why I advocate for doing a lot of observational drawing. That's a skill that you want to kind of get yourself used to as well. So really good excuse to get out on weekend and go down the park and go sit with some trees. Maybe there's a nice pine tree. So say we've got a nice pine tree. I've not given myself enough room here. You've got a nice pine tree, and that's quite a nice simple one. Pine trees are a nice simple one to start with. So you start with the trunk, and then really basic kind of sort of like you block it out. So that's the rough shape of the tree, and then you were like, okay, so where would the branches be? So the branches would be there, and then you start to define those kind of sort of areas of needles, and it's about kind of sort of blocking those basic shapes. So again with hair, you want to block out that basic shape. So what we've done here is we've kind of blocked out the basic shape of the pine tree, and then we've identified where the branches will go, and then we're blocking out those pads of leaves. And then what you can go in and do is do a bit more detail. So where the shade will be, so we'll say the light's coming from this way, and then, you know, then in the shade what you can do is use the detail to suggest shade. So you can do And this is the same with hair. We'll do some leaves here. And this is where I would suggest sort of starting to experiment with mark making. We'll go into that later. But there you go. So, you know, we're getting some of that shape and volume. There's a technique I want to, and I don't know if it might be like a little bit advanced to kind of speak about here, but there's a really good technique. There's a absolute banger of a gent called John Watkiss. He worked for a lot of studios like Disney and Warner Brothers, and what he uses to kind of sort of, I'll link the video because he's just wonderful to watch. The way that he kind of starts to build kind of volume. So a lot of people will kind of sort of like use kind of sort of the basic, like we looked at last episode with the owl, where you draw a circle and then you draw, you know, another circle and maybe a half circle or like, you know, a couple of lines. That's a very sort of like, you know, that'll get you started. It'll start to get you to kind of break down that form. It'll get your eye used to kind of sort of like, you know, looking what's in front of you and kind of starting to break it down into those kind of basic shapes. What John Watkiss does, he uses this kind of sort of wire hoop method, and what it does is it kind of sort of naturally, kind of, give it a watch. Is, you know, a really inspiring gent, absolute master of anatomy, and you know, watch him work and watch him kind of sort of like kind of summarize the human form. It's like there's a certain magic to it, and I, you know, anyway, but he uses this kind of wire hoop method to start kind of building some sort of like natural shape and volume and perspective. So, right, with these here, so say we've got our pine tree. Can you see there? So what he'll do with the pine tree, so you got this, we'll do a bit more of a, again, a broadleaf tree. And if you use like the wire hoop method, it's a really good way of building that kind of sort of natural volume. So you've got this nice kind of sort of like lovely rounded volume here. Don't know if you can see that. And we'll again just block in the trunk. So again, it's going to be a nice sort of like broadleaf oak, because that's sort of like, you know, what people are kind of sort of used to kind of seeing when they picture a tree. And you block in those branches, and once you get the structure of those branches in, that informs the shape of the tree. We've gone for quite a sort of like rounded, kind of sort of like, you know, uniform tree, just to kind of express that kind of sort of like, okay. So what the wire hoop method has done here for us is it's naturally kind of sort of started to kind of build that volume for us. So right, with these kind of pads here, you give them a bit of volume and a bit of depth and a bit of shading. You put the detail in with the leaves. So yeah, this is naturally, this now informs us. So we know where the branches are, and this will inform us where we can put that kind of shaded detail. So I don't know if this is starting to kind of make any sense here. I don't know if this is getting ahead of anyone a little bit, but yeah, so it's a really nice technique of starting to build up that kind of volume, where you can then put in that detail. So we're breaking objects down. So we're breaking complex objects down into kind of more simple. So with the tree, the branches inform where the pads and leaves are, and then you can start to add a bit of volume and shading by adding in some of the detail of the leaves. Again, you know, when I'm adding the leaves here, they're very simple. We're not going into all of the detail of the leaf. You can do some nice studies with some leaves if you want to. They're a lovely thing to stick in your sketchbook. You know, go find yourself. I particularly love when sort of like you've had a leaf that's kind of sort of like, I don't know if you've got a leaf like it's kind of sort of like, you know, it's kind of degraded down a bit and it's just left the veins. That's really pretty. Lovely things to stick in your sketchbook. Lovely things to observe and draw. But again, as long as you follow those principles of kind of breaking things down into kind of sort of like simpler shapes, then, you know, it makes the whole task. It's very easy, like with hair, to kind of look at something like hair and just kind of, like I say, get lost a little bit in the woods for the trees, or the trees for the woods. Yeah, similar situation where you're kind of sort of like, you know, you miss the woods for the trees because you're focusing on sort of like, you know, you've got sort of like lots and lots and lots of little strands. What you do with the hair is you'll block in. So my silly little round head here, I don't have a lot of it, but you block in. What you would do is you would block in that kind of, you know, that kind of shape. So we've got a bit of a wedge shape going on here, and then sort of where there is sort of little bit of detail here, the light is kind of coming over here. So what you would want to do is you would want to start putting those kind of sort of details, and get a sketchbook, get comfy with mark making, get comfy with sort of like summarizing. What we're doing is we're summarizing. So with the detail, we're summarizing. With the shape, we're summarizing. With the shape, we're breaking it down into its basic shapes, its basic constituent parts, and we're summarizing it. And we're building it up from blocks. So how do you build a building? You don't look at all the bricks and panic. You look at a blueprint, and the blueprint will say, okay, so, you know, you want to place your blocks in a orderly fashion, and then you build the building. So that's what we're doing, is we're summarizing things, we're simplifying things, we're breaking things down. You start with the trunk, you kind of build the branches, and the ends of those branches is where you'll get, you know, you'll get these pads of leaves. And then again with the leaves, we're summarizing, so we're not drawing each and every leaf. That would be incredibly painstaking. Some people do that and they're crazy. I respect them. So where I started to get lost early on is that I look at the detail and I get completely lost in the detail and I completely lose the structure. And that's what happens for a lot of people, and then they put the pen down and they go home and they never touch their sketchbook again. So what you want to do is you want to start training yourself into this habit. So we've got a leaf here. What do we do when we see a leaf? We don't start going, wah, wah, and I descend into scribbling. We want to look at the leaf and we want to go, okay, what shape is the leaf? So we've got a nice hazel leaf. So it's that lovely heart shape, and then it's got some serrations around the edge. Okay, that's nice. And then you'll get that self-same kind of fractal. So you've got the central vein, and then off of the central vein you get smaller veins, and then even smaller again at the edges. And that's what's happening with those branches. And at the end of those branches you get the pads of leaves, and instead of drawing each and every leaf, I mean, it would be, we can do, if you want to be here all day, do that, but you'll be there all day. I mean, how much time, you know, people who do photorealistic sort of drawings in pencil and oil paintings are crazy, and I respect you, and that takes mad talent and it's incredibly impressive. But, you know, even then, when you watch that process, that's what they're doing. They're just building that you get the basic elements, you get the basic shapes, you block in the basic, and we'll get into shading. So you get the basic elements, and then you work in the detail on top of that. So it's breaking that task down, it's getting familiar with summarizing, and then you build the detail on top. So yeah, that's how you. No, this isn't a very pretty tree. I hope your trees look better than this, but this is just, you know, to kind of instruct the general principle on you. So yeah, basically, what we're doing is we're summarising. So, you know, you can go in and do each and every leaf, but it's much, much easier to just kind of say like, okay, we're approaching these leaves almost as a texture. So we're just kind of sort of building. So when we look at these pads of leaves and we look at sort of like, you know, we're using the detailing with the leaves to add in a bit of shading and a bit of shape and a bit of volume and a bit of texture. So what basically is a leaf when you're looking at it on a tree? With a pine, it's more needles. So you've got sort of like your pine needles. Maybe you can put a couple of pine cones there. Again, with pine cones, I love pine cones. That is too small for you to see. Okay, put some pine cones there. Anyway, so, yeah, so you've got your little twig on your pine tree. Don't know if you can see that. And at the end of that twig, there's some pine cones there. Trust them. You can just about see them. Right, and at the end of those twigs, what do? You put the pine needles. There you go. And then basically, you know, you do that over and over and over again for your pine tree. So again, it'll be based on those little pads, those little sprays of leaves. So yeah, what's happening here is you've got these branches and they're branching out, and then maybe they're branching out again. And, you know, you can go as far as you want. You know, that's fractal structures for you. They branch and branch and branch and into infinity if you know want to do that. Less so with actual trees. And then at the end of those twigs, those very end twigs, you will have the leaves. And these pads of leaves are just little sort of like bushels, little kind of sort of like, you know, I don't know if you've looked at sort of like, you know, arrangements of flowers. If you look, Buddleia is a really good example. They are basically, you know, clusters of smaller individual objects. Same with the hair. Your hair is a, you know, just a cluster of individual, very, very fine hairs. So you block out the shape, you use the leaves, we summarise the leaves as, you know, in this case it's a broadleaf tree. We'll say like it's a, you know, we'll say it's like a hazel. So you've got these little heart-shaped leaves that sort of like, kind of sort of like, when you zoom out to the bigger picture, you know, they just look like little U-shaped. There you go. And you just kind of block that in. So what you're doing is you're, again, making lines, little rows, same with like, you know, tiles on a roof, of these little U-shapes, where it's helpful to kind of sort of use that wire hoop method. And I would definitely recommend, like I said, watch him. You'll understand why all the old Disney animations, I mean, the animation was absolutely gorgeous. You'll understand why when you watch this guy work. And yeah, there's a real magic to it. And, you know, there's a real sort of like charm to the way that he speaks about it as well. And it is just about summarising. It's about sort of breaking tasks down into more approachable steps for yourself. And yeah, no, it's the same with any bigger task. Is you break it down into those, you know, individual steps. You kind of sort of like summarise things, and yeah, no, that's how you build the structure. That's how you approach something like quite complex like a tree. You know, you follow basic rules and principles. You break things down into smaller, more, you know, achievable tasks. And then, yeah, you build up sort of like more complex detail from there. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I would absolutely definitely recommend, I'll link it below. Definitely sit down with a cup of tea, watch the way he works, he's amazing. And yeah, no, that's how you approach something like a tree. So it looks really scary and complex, like with hair, but all you're doing is, like I said, taking yourself out of that kind of sort of like, ooh, can't see the woods for the trees. You're stepping back and you're looking at the, the bigger picture. So you're looking at sort of like this cluster of leaves here as a whole shape. So, this is quite sort of like a round tree. And then you're kind of sort of, you're, like I said, start with the trunk, follow the ends of the branches, look at bonsai. Lovely calming thing to do after a stressful day at work. Get your sketchbook out, get yourself a lavender or a peppermint or a chamomile or, whatever your poison is. Glass of wine. Sit down, have your pina colada, have your glass of wine, have your peppermint tea, pop your sketchbook out and just take a little look at some lovely bonsai videos, and familiarise yourself with that kind of sort of like, because what they do with bonsai is they start by training the main branches and then they, prune and trim these lovely little pads of leaves. And the reason why they're really good to kind of start with is they really demonstrate that kind of fact very well, where they kind of sort of like tidy them up into these really nice defined sort of pads of leaves. They're a really good place to start with trees. Pop out to the park, making an excuse to go have a picnic in the park with your sketchbook. Your sketchbook is, I always say, it's a little bit like, a dog or like a tray of cocktail sausages. It's an excuse. You're at the party and you've got your cocktail sausages. There's a really sweet lady, I go to this life drawing kind of sort of weekly thing, and she kind of sort of like, she's like, talking about how she sort of like uses sort of like a tray of cocktail sausages, and this is an excuse to talk to people at parties. Similar thing with your sketchbook. It's a bit like your dog. You go for a jog with your dog, you're like, come on dog, let's go for a jog. So you take your sketchbook out and you make an excuse to, it's a nice day, we'll have a picnic, we'll sit down, we'll draw some trees. So yeah, hope that's helpful. Have a look at some bonsai videos. Make an excuse to, set up a picnic and go down the park and draw some trees. Yeah, that's how you draw some happy little trees. Actually not that scary when you break things down, into little steps for yourself. Thank you so much. If you've enjoyed, like and subscribe. I'll be doing more of these. Thank you so much. We will see each other again, hopefully. Thank you for your time. It's been lovely to meet you. Bye-bye.